Well, welcome to episode 424 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this record, which came out on Dawn Records in 1956. It's by Zoot Sims. It's called The Modern Art of Jazz. This is a record from the mid-50s, which comes fairly early on in Zoot Sims' career as essentially a freelance jazz artist, a position he either found himself in or chose for much of the rest of his career. It's made by a combination of bop musicians and swing-era musicians, and while it is clearly a modern jazz record, as advertised by the title, there are very certainly some traditional swing aspects which are evident in some of the playing and, more importantly, the arrangements. It's a record which is full of technical flair, and while you wouldn't call it an audiophile's dream, it's a great example of this phase of Zoot Sims' career. I'd previously discussed Zoot Sims' history in a fairly abbreviated way when I talked about the record Tenor Conclave in episode 366. That's the record he made with John Coltrane, Al Cohn, and Hank Mobley. So here I'll dig a little deeper. I'll remind you that he came from LA and that he was one of a large crop of tenor players who emerged in the 1940s, having been heavily influenced by the laid-back sound of Lester Young. However, his earlier influence was in fact the more muscular sound of Coleman Hawkins. Sims first emerged on the Central Avenue scene in LA, and like Art Pepper, he gained a lot of credibility in those early years as a white musician, being able to go toe-to-toe with some of the very best black jazz musicians on the scene. After a brief time with Benny Goodman in 1943, he then joins the Air Force. He's there until 1946. When he comes back to civilian life, he rejoins Benny Goodman, but just for a brief period of time, because the big band era was winding down and Goodman was having to downsize. However, some orchestras had prospered by managing to adapt their sound to incorporate modern jazz, and it was with those orchestras, particularly Woody Herman's band, that Zoot Sims first made his name, and he did so as part of Woody Herman's famous Four Brothers sound. That sound, of course, incorporated three tenor sax players, which was Zoot Sims, Herbie Stewart, and Stan Getz, and a baritone sax player, Serge Chaloff. Soon after Sims' arrival, that lineup continues to evolve, and Al Cohn comes in on tenor sax, and Sims and Cohn form a fast friendship and an ongoing collaboration in the studio and in the clubs, which would last for much of the rest of their careers. After leaving the Woody Herman band in the late 1940s, Zoot goes on to play with Artie Shaw, and he also begins his recording career. His first recordings as a leader occur in Europe, in Sweden and then in France, in the spring of 1950. Back in New York in the early 1950s, he also appears on some of the very earliest Prestige Records releases. In 1953, the appeal of a regular paycheck led him back into big band life with Stan Kenton's band. And it's worth noting that although Zoot would largely blaze his own trail after this, his musicianship and his great sense of humor meant that he never was lacking for an offer to join a larger ensemble if that's what suited him. There's certainly no doubting how well liked he was. You can find any number of testimonials. Bill Holman talks about how he would completely lighten the mood on the tour bus with Kenton. And Zoot was also renowned for his one-liners. He's a guy who famously called Stan Getz a great bunch of guys. And it was probably his easygoing nature combined with his tendency sometimes to shun the spotlight, which leads to what I think is maybe the most anomalous aspect of his career. Because here's a guy who, arguably is one of the top 20 musicians to play tenor sax in the modern jazz idiom, maybe even in a tighter circle than that. But I don't think you'd find a lot of argument. He's a wonderful player and he was greatly respected by his peers. But unlike a lot of other people in that category, he never really established himself as a permanent solo leader going forward, nor did he stick with any one record label for more than a couple of records at a time. If you think of people like Miles Davis, like John Coltrane, or Sonny Rollins, or Lee Morgan, horn players of real renown, most of these people end up leading their own groups, forming a pretty solid relationship with record labels, and they never really look back. Not so Zoot. He's found in supportive or collaborative roles all the way through his career right to the very end. Now this could be because he was a bit of a handful, because it is undeniable that he had some, what you might call, refueling issues. He did use heroin at points, but largely he's known as an extremely heavy drinker, basically a high-functioning alcoholic. But it never really got in his way in the studio or in the clubs particularly. Instead, from what I've read, it really seems to me that it was institutional jazz life, belonging to a band for a long period of time or being owned in some respects by a label, that didn't appeal to Sims. In fact, I think you could go so far as to say he consciously avoids being tied down that way. So he's kind of the anti-Horace Silver. Horace Silver famously spent, I think it's 28 years consecutively with Blue Note Records. In the same period of time, Sims releases as a leader or as a co-leader records for 50 separate labels, which I think is astonishing. Now, I don't want to overstate the case about his peripatetic nature. He does alight in certain resting places for periods of time. One of those resting places is his musical relationship with Al Cohn, which is a source of great delight in his catalog on many different occasions. He also played on and off with Gerry Mulligan, but really between the mid-1950s and the early 1970s, he's essentially a freelancer, and it's only when Norman Granz, with his Pablo Records operation, makes a bit of a project of bringing Zoot back into the public eye in the mid-1970s that he ever establishes anything like a run of records on one label. This record comes from Zoot's earliest days back in New York in the mid-1950s. He looks a little bit sheepish on the front cover, I always think, and it's true that if you'd gone back a year prior to when this photograph was taken, it would have been hard to believe that he'd be back in New York, back in the limelight, making his own records. He left the Kenton Band having had a big blowout with Kenton on the side of a road in Pennsylvania where their bus had broken down. He'd gone back to California. He let bad habits get the better of him. He was eventually working as a house painter. He pops up a couple times playing sax on some live records recorded at the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach, but otherwise that's basically it. And eventually it was Gerry Mulligan, who himself was on a bit of a journey back to respectability, who found him, rescued him, and brings him back to New York to be part of his sextet. And this is a great development in Sims' life for several reasons. First of all, he was now getting regular exposure as a part of Mulligan's sextet, and Mulligan was a fairly high-profile player in those days. Secondly, being back in New York gives him an opportunity to reconnect with his friend and on-off musical partner, Al Cohn. And third, and you can hear this quite obviously on this record, he benefited very much from the experiences and the influence and the connections that he absorbed within Mulligan's group. One of those connections is with the valve trombonist Bob Brookmeyer, who's on this record and has a fairly major influence on its sound. And so it was in New York, beginning around Christmas 1955, that Zoot achieves creative liftoff in one of the most productive periods of his career. In the next 12 months, he'd go into the studio 44 times, and he'd release 12 records as either a leader or as a co-leader. And for you arithmetic fans, that's one a month. This record is made very early in that run. It's made on January 11th and January 18th, 1956. The studio, sadly, is lost to the sands of time. The producer was Chuck Darwin, the 19th century evolutionary theorist who had a late career flourish as a jazz producer. The recording quality, I would say, is fairly perfunctory for 1956. It's still in the reasonable category, but this is, again, no audiophile stream. It's a quintet format, and the players on here are Sims on tenor, Brookmeyer on valve trombone, John Williams on piano, and the swing-era duo of Milt Hinton on bass and Gus Johnson on drums. Side 1 starts with September in the Rain, and this bouncy track is a great introduction to the record because what it demonstrates is the easy interplay and contrapuntal work, the weaving lines between Sims and Brookmeyer. Much the same can be said of the second track, Down at the Loft, which is another up-tempo swinger. Ghost of a Chance takes the tempo down. It's a charming ballad. There's a great little outing for John Williams here. And the final track on side 1, Not So Deep, takes us back to that Mulligan-esque contrapuntal arrangement. The only real difference from Mulligan's early 50s sound, I would say, is the presence of a piano. The first track on side 2, Them Their Eyes, continues in the same vein. And then we come to my favorite track on the record, which is called Our Pad. It's a Bob Brookmeyer song, kind of a mid-tempo swinger. Dark Clouds is one of the several Sims originals on here, with perhaps his most compelling solo on the record. And the record concludes with one of the more interesting tracks, which is One to Blow On. This is also written by Sims. It's got a feature for Brookmeyer, who has some very amusing lines in this. I don't mean vocal lines, I mean trombone lines. Kind of sounds like what I would call strangled trombone. There's also a playful solo for Milt Hinton on here. It's a fairly rollicking way to end the record. This review ended up being a bit delayed because I kept listening to this record, trying to decide what I thought about it. Its sound is much earlier in jazz in terms of evolutionary terms than the work that Sims does with Al Cohn. But in the end, what really began to grow on me was the interplay between Sims and Brookmeyer and the echoes of those early 1950s Mulligan recordings, which I love so much. It's a record which could do with a bit more spontaneity and perhaps less uniformity in the way the tracks are arranged and in their duration, but it's still very enjoyable, and it's certainly one to pick up if you come across it in the stacks. I give it 3.5 stars.